The night shift at St. Michael's in Savannah runs on fluorescent hum and antiseptic burn, cold steel gurneys wheeling through corridors where Hannah Clarke moves like a ghost, efficient, invisible, forgettable. She's been here 6 months, always takes the overnight rotation, never speaks unless spoken to. In her locker sits a pair of worn combat boots, scuffed leather cracked at the toes, laces frayed but knotted tight. She touches them each shift before closing the door, the ritual taking exactly 4 seconds, muscle memory from a life no one here knows existed. Her hands don't shake during for insertion. Her gait doesn't favor either leg despite the scar tissue visible when she reaches for supplies on high shelves, pale lines that map trajectories through her forearms like a road atlas no civilian nurse would recognize. When she takes vitals, her eyes track trajectories, blood pressure patterns, oxygen saturation curves, the subtle shift in a patient's breathing that means sepsis is coming. She sees what others miss because she was trained to see what others miss, back when seeing meant the difference between her team coming home or not coming home at all. The night ward at St. Michael's runs skeleton crew. Hannah prefers it this way. 3 nurses covering 23 beds, the attending physician checking email from his home office, the resident somewhere in the building trying to sleep. Hannah prefers the silence. The darkness outside the windows feels familiar, the kind of darkness that comes at 0200 hours when you've been awake for 16 hours straight and your hands have learned to work without asking your brain permission. She moves from room 402 to 403 to 404, checking full lines, adjusting flow rates, reading monitors the way other people read text messages, automatic, thorough, the kind of careful attention that catches problems before they become crises. Her scrubs are blue, standard issue. Nothing remarkable about them except for the way they fit a frame that moves with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who has spent a decade training her body to respond instantly to chaos. She doesn't look remarkable. That's deliberate. That's the point. Room for 12 holds Major Vincent Cross, Special Forces Command, recovering from a training accident that shattered 3 ribs and collapsed his left lung 4 weeks ago. The surgical team repaired the damage, but Cross still moves like his chest might betray him, still winces when he coughs. Hannah enters at 0158, carries her tablet with vitals logged from the previous shift, doesn't make eye contact with the man in the bed. She knows who he is. He doesn't know she knows. This is the arrangement they've settled into without ever discussing it. The way soldiers understand silence means don't ask questions I can't answer and don't tell me things that will complicate your recovery. She checks the monitor first, cardiac rhythm normal, O2 sat 96% on 2 liters nasal cannula, blood pressure 117/72, all of it exactly where it should be. Her fingers move across the 4 pump, confirming flow rate, no kinks in the line, the saline bag hanging at the right height. Professional. Competent. Invisible. Cross watches her work. His left forearm rests on top of the blanket, and there on his biceps sits black ink that spells a call sign in military sans serif font, the kind of tattoo that means something specific to a very small group of people. Hannah's eyes never drop to it. Her gaze stays on the monitor, on the 4 line, on the ceiling. She's had 6 months of practice at not seeing that tattoo, at moving through room for 12 as if it were any other room, as if the man in the bed were any other patient recovering from any other injury. She adjusts his drip with movements that suggest she's done this 1,000 times under worse conditions, and she has. In Helmand Province. In the Sanjin Valley. In the kind of field conditions where your hands learn to work by touch and memory because the alternative was watching someone bleed out while you fumbled with equipment in the dark. Your oxygen looks good, Hannah says, her voice quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from someone who knows how to speak in the darkness without breaking the darkness. Exactly 10 words. Short, professional, nothing in them that would hint at the 15 years of classified operations training sitting behind her eyes. She doesn't ask how he's feeling. She can read the monitor. She can see the way his breathing shifts when pain spikes. She can count the seconds between each breath and know whether his lung function is improving or declining. Questions are unnecessary. Cross nods. He doesn't speak. He hasn't spoken much to anyone since arriving 6 weeks ago. She's read his chart, observed his patterns, understands that he's living in the space between recovery and reckoning, the place where your body heals but your mind hasn't caught up yet. She finishes the vitals check at 0204, makes notes on the tablet, and turns toward the door with the same economical efficiency she brought to the room. "Thank you," Cross says, barely audible. Hannah pauses for half a second. Then she's gone, moving down the corridor toward room for 13, her footsteps silent on the tile because she walks the way soldiers walk, weight distributed, heel to toe, the way that lets you move fast if you need to but stay quiet if you should. By 06:30, the night shift begins its transition to morning rounds. Hannah finishes her last set of vitals checks. She hasn't slept. She never sleeps after the night shift, goes home and sits on her porch with coffee that gets cold while she watches the sunrise over Forsyth Park and tries to remember what it felt like to want something beyond the next shift, the next patient, the next moment where she can be useful. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, a sound like insects trapped in plastic. She hears it now because she's tired, and tiredness makes the world loud again. Dr. Whitfield arrives for morning rounds at 0630 sharp, coffee in hand, white coat pressed sharp enough to cut, shoes polished to a shine that suggests someone else polishes them. He's 48 years old, Harvard Medical School, fellowships at Johns Hopkins and Duke, and he runs the surgical wing at St. Michael's the way a general runs occupied territory, through a combination of institutional authority, strategic alliances, and a well-calibrated system of public humiliation that keeps the staff obedient. He's been here 15 years. He owns this place in every way that matters except the deed. When he walks through the ward, residents scatter. When he speaks, nurses nod and find ways to agree. When he looks at Hannah Clarke on her 6th month of night shift, moving through post-op checks with the kind of quiet competence that doesn't beg for recognition, he sees a threat. It's not about her nursing skill. It's about the fact that she doesn't seem to want his approval. Everyone wants Dr. Whitfield's approval. It's currency here. It translates to shift preferences, good evaluations, recommendations for other hospitals, the kind of professional capital that matters when you're building a career. Hannah doesn't appear to want any of it. She takes the night shift. She never volunteers for the surgical rotation where she might impress him. She doesn't laugh at his jokes in the break room. She simply does her job and disappears. The break room at 0700 is where the night shift and morning shift overlap, fluorescent lights humming their insect song, the smell of burnt coffee and someone's leftover lasagna from 3 days ago mixing with the ever-present hospital undertone of bleach and decay. Hannah carries her lunch tray from the cafeteria, salad, grilled chicken, bottled water, and walks toward the only empty table, her movements economical, her face neutral. She's learned not to expect kindness. She's learned that workplaces are hierarchies and that the best position in a hierarchy is the one where nobody notices you exist. Dr. Whitfield stands near the coffee machine, speaking to 2 residents and an attending physician, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that comes from knowing everyone in the room understands you hold their professional futures in your hands. He laughs at something someone says, a sound that doesn't quite reach his eyes. Then he sees Hannah, moving toward her table, and he doesn't change his trajectory. He simply continues forward, and at the precise moment her path intersects with his elbow rises. The tray hits the floor. Food scatters across the tile in slow motion, the salad box tumbling, lettuce spreading in a green arc, the grilled chicken sliding sideways, the bottled water spinning like a top before settling in a small puddle at her feet. The sound of impact carries through the break room, that specific clatter of metal tray on tile that makes everyone look up. The room doesn't go silent immediately. It takes half a second for the silence to arrive, for everyone to understand that this was deliberate, that this was about something other than an accidental collision. Hannah looks at the scattered food on the floor. Not at Dr. Whitfield. Not at the faces turning toward her. At the food. "Oops," Whitfield says, and his tone suggests genuine surprise, the careful performance of a man who knows exactly what he's done and is betting the room won't call him on it. "I didn't see your tray." Careless of me. Hannah bends to retrieve the scattered containers. Her jaw doesn't tighten. Her hands don't shake. She moves the same way she moves through vitals checks, methodical, efficient, utterly present. She gathers the tray, stacks the scattered items, and stands without meeting anyone's eyes. You should be more careful, Whitfield says, still performing surprise, still playing the role of the distracted doctor, too important to watch where he's walking. You might trip someone next time. She walks to the trash and disposes of the food. 20 seconds pass. Then she walks back toward the hallway, heading for the supply closet where she can reset herself before her shift ends. No one follows her. No one speaks. The room returns to its previous conversations, but the tone has changed. Everyone heard it. Everyone understood. The supply closet is 3 feet by 5 feet, crammed with 4 kits and gauze bundles and boxes of latex gloves stacked on metal shelves. Hannah closes the door. Locks it. Walks to the sink and grips the edge with both hands, her knuckles turning white with the pressure, her breathing controlled but visible in the rise and fall of her shoulders. She stays that way for exactly 90 seconds. Her hands don't tremble. Her jaw doesn't clench visibly. But her knuckles go white the way a fist goes white when you're holding onto something to prevent yourself from doing something you can't take back. When she releases the sink, she's steady again. The mask is back in place. She unlaces her scrubs, reaches into her locker, and touches the worn combat boots, scuffed leather, frayed laces, the smell of old leather and dust from another life. For seconds. Then she relocks the locker and returns to the ward. Dr. Whitfield is doing rounds in room for 10, speaking to a post-op patient who listens with the careful attention of someone in pain who understands that doctors are temporary gods. Hannah moves past the room without looking in. She has 3 more hours on her shift. She has 3 more hours of moving through the ward like a ghost, checking monitors, adjusting drips, carrying the weight of things no one here will ever understand. It's 0900 when Drive Whitfield approaches her in the hallway outside room for 15. He's holding a patient chart, thick folder, a smile on his face that suggests he's thought of something amusing. Hannah is checking the 4 pump on the room's current patient, a 63-year-old woman recovering from appendectomy. Clarke, Whitfield says, using her last name the way someone uses a command. She turns, her eyes level with his, her expression neutral. Whitfield holds out the chart. This fell on the floor earlier. I assume it's yours. You should be more careful with patient documentation. HIPAA violations are serious business. Hannah reaches for the chart. Before her fingers touch it, Whitfield releases it, and the folder drops to the tile with a sound like a gunshot. Papers scatter, some of them sliding across the floor. The chart lands face down, and Whitfield steps back with that same practice surprise. Clumsy today, aren't we? His smile doesn't waver. Pick that up, sweetheart. The room is not silent. Monitors beep. A ventilator hisses in the distance. The hospital continues its work around them. But in the corridor, in the space between Hannah and Dr. Whitfield, the air has become a thing with weight and substance. Hannah bends. Her hands are steady as she retrieves the scattered papers, as she stacks them back into the folder, as she stands and holds the chart without looking at him. She doesn't speak. She doesn't need to. Her silence is a kind of answer, the kind that carries more weight than any argument could carry. Whitfield watches her for 3 seconds. Then he walks away, his satisfaction apparent in the way he moves, the confidence of someone who's just proven a point to a room full of people. Hannah stands in the hallway with the patient chart in her hands. Her breath is even. Her pulse is steady. Her eyes track the space where he stood, and for exactly 1 moment, something cold moves behind her face, not anger, something deeper, something colder, something that says if circumstances were different and rules were different and consequences were different, she would teach Dr. Whitfield things about his own limitations that he wouldn't forget. Then the moment passes. She turns toward room for 15, returns the chart to its proper place, and continues her rounds as though furniture just spoke to her and she's choosing not to listen. Her shift ends at 1500. She walks out of St. Michael's into the Savannah heat, moves to her car without looking back, and sits behind the wheel with the engine off, her forehead resting against the steering wheel. Tomorrow night she'll return. The night after that, she'll return again. The rules are clear. The hierarchy is established. And somewhere in room for 12, Major Cross will sleep with a tattoo on his arm spelling a name he hasn't spoken aloud in 3 years, a name that belongs to someone he's been pretending not to see every time she enters his room to check his vitals. The break room at St. Michael's smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of 0700 on a Tuesday morning when nobody had slept. Dr. Whitfield gathered them like a general addressing troops, 8 nurses, 2 residents, the phlebotomist, his presence taking up more space than his body actually occupied. He stood with his back to the counter, arms crossed, and smiled the way a shark smiles before feeding. "I want to introduce everyone to our newest team member," Whitfield said, his voice carrying into the hallway with the kind of deliberate projection that meant he wanted an audience. "Hannah Clarke. Nurse with that special military precision." He let the word hang. Military. Very rigid. Very by the book. He turned to face the room directly. "I'm going to make a public bet, who's with me, that she quits within 1 week. 7 days. I'm taking odds." Laughter rippled through the room like a contagion. Someone from the afternoon shift called out, "You're on, document." Another voice, "I'll take that action." Whitfield's smile widened. He was a man who understood leverage the way a pianist understands keys. Hannah stood at the coffee maker in the far corner, back to the room, pouring with hands that moved like instruments calibrated to one precise function. The liquid didn't waver. Her jaw didn't clench. She was made of something that didn't flinch at noise. "What do you say, Clarke?" Whitfield's voice turned theatrical. "You going to prove me wrong? Or are you going to show us all that you're exactly what I think you are?" She capped the carafe. Turned. Met his eyes for exactly 1 second, a second that lasted like a held breath, and said in a voice that sounded like a cardiac monitor flatline, "Excuse me." She walked past him to her station. Her shoulder didn't brush his, though he'd angled himself to make contact likely. His jaw tightened just slightly. The room had gone quiet in the way rooms do when someone refuses to give the reaction being demanded. That afternoon, the cafeteria was crowded with the lunch shift, that peak chaos when the hospital's hierarchy arranged itself in visible layers. The doctors sat at one table. The nurses at another. The support staff knew their place. Hannah carried her tray past the physician's table, turkey sandwich, fruit cup, water, and that's when Dr. Whitfield extended his elbow like he was conducting an orchestra. His arm caught her tray's edge with the kind of precision that had to be practiced, that couldn't be accident. The tray tumbled downward in slow motion, soup splashing across the tile in a geometric pattern, the plate shattering with a sound like bone breaking. 50 people turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. "Oh, clumsy," Whitfield said, not looking up from his salad. His colleagues around the table smiled like they'd been trained to smile at the right moments. "Better clean that up before someone slips. Liability issue. Hospital's responsibility if you don't." Hannah's jaw muscle flickered once, a single involuntary contraction, and then stopped. Her hands remained perfectly steady as she kneeled on the tile and began collecting pieces. A ceramic shard cut the edge of her palm, drew a thin line of blood, and she wiped it on a napkin without breaking rhythm. She picked up each element methodically: fork, knife, the rim of the plate, napkin soaked with soup. The conversations around her resumed because that's what people do when they witness something they've been signaled to ignore. She became invisible. She became furniture. She became the kind of person you look past. It took her 8 minutes to clean it all. She stood, threw the debris into the trash, and returned to her station for her shift. Blood dripped from the cut on her palm, and she wrapped it with gauze from the supply drawer, securing it with tape, and pulled on fresh gloves. The cut would ache for 3 days. That was information. Pain was data. 2 hours into the evening shift, at the nurse's station where the patient charts lived in their metal holders like small flags of responsibility, Dr. Whitfield arrived with a chart in hand. He stood beside Hannah, waited until she looked up, and then released it from shoulder height like dropping a stone. Paper scattered across the tile in a cascade, each page tumbling. 3 nurses looked away. The resident pretended to study his phone. 1 chart corner landed at Hannah's feet, the rest fanned across a 10-foot radius. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Whitfield said, his voice warm as a surgical lamp. "And next time, file it properly. This isn't the VA. We maintain standards here." Hannah crouched without speaking, gathering each page in sequence, reordering them by patient number, restacking them in the proper folder. Her hands moved like she'd been born knowing how to do this. Whitfield watched from above, waiting for something in her face to crack, waiting for tears or anger or that moment when someone breaks and gives him what he wanted, a reason to dismiss her, a justification he could frame as her weakness. She stood, chart in hand, and met his eyes. Her face was carved from something harder than bone. "Yes, doctor," she said. 10 words. A statement of acknowledgement. Nothing more. He leaned closer, close enough that she could smell the cologne he wore to assert position. "You don't belong here. This job requires warmth. Empathy. A bedside manner that you clearly don't possess. You're a robot, Clarke. A machine. And I'm going to make sure everyone sees it before the week is out." She filed the chart in its proper place. Turned to her next patient. Continued her rounds as if he were nothing, not a threat, not an obstacle, not even a person worthy of acknowledgement. She was a nurse. There was work to do. Everything else was irrelevant noise. But at 2,200 hours, during her 15-minute break in the supply closet where the expired medications waited in their bins and the fluorescent lights buzzed like insects, Hannah Clarke gripped the edge of the sink until her knuckles bleached white, all the blood driven out by pressure, her hands becoming pale claws. Her forehead rested against the cold stainless steel. Her breathing came in counts, for in through the nose, hold for 4, out for 4. The kind of breathing taught in interrogation resistance training, the kind that keeps your nervous system from betraying you. Her palm was bleeding again through the gauze. She rewrapped it without looking, movements automatic, movements that belonged to someone who'd been wounded in ways that didn't show in X-rays. Outside the supply closet, St. Michael's hummed with its nighttime rhythm. Monitors beeping in monitored cadences. Ventilators cycling their mechanical breathing. The elevator dinging softly as it rose and fell, carrying the broken and the frightened and the dying between floors. Hannah Clarke adjusted her posture, checked her reflection in the darkened window of the supply closet, uniform straight, hair secured, no visible evidence of anything other than composure, and returned to her station. Major Vincent Cross in room for 12 watched her move past his doorway like he'd been watching for the right moment. He'd seen her hand shake once in the supply closet, visible through the small window in the door if you knew what you were looking at, visible if you'd shared sand and mortar fire and the specific kind of terror that only comes when your entire team is pinned and the helicopters are still 17 minutes out. He'd seen Master Chief Clarke under pressure. He'd seen what she was capable of. And he was watching Dr. Whitfield the way you watch a threat assessment, cataloguing angles, measuring distance, calculating exactly when the threat would need to be neutralized. But he said nothing. Not yet. The protocol was clear. Hannah Clarke was invisible now, and visible people got asked questions that led to other questions, the kind that ended with redacted files and lawyers instructing everyone to stay quiet about operations that officially never happened in locations that officially didn't exist. So the Major watched. And he waited. The week progressed with the mechanical inevitability of a poorly wound clock. Whitfield's public bet circulated through the hospital's hierarchy like a virus, spreading downward from the physicians to the residents to the nurses to the support staff. It acquired details that bore no resemblance to what had actually been said. Hannah had talked back to the chief of surgery. Hannah had endangered a patient. Hannah was unstable, unprofessional, a walking liability. The story metastasized. By Thursday, orderlies were whispering about her in supply closets. By Friday, a resident asked the charge nurse if Hannah had some kind of condition, PTSD, maybe, or personality disorder, that might need addressing through HR. Hannah continued her night shifts with the kind of perfection that felt like a weapon. She was never late. Never made an error. Never missed a vital sign, never fumbled a catheter, never spoke out of turn. Her patients got the best care on the floor because she moved through their rooms with a precision that transcended standard nursing. She checked on a 92-year-old woman with congestive heart failure, adjusted her oxygen, sat with her for 2 minutes in silence that somehow communicated more than words could. She restarted and 4 on a post-op patient on the first try while the resident needed 3 attempts. She noticed a subtle change in an elderly man's breathing pattern that turned out to be early sepsis, flagged it before the monitors showed the full picture, potentially saved his life. But none of it mattered because Whitfield had already decided her story. Invisible workers didn't accumulate evidence of their value. Invisible workers just disappeared. On Saturday at 23:40, with 10 minutes left on her shift, Hannah was documenting patient notes at the nurse's station when her phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number: "They're going to move against you. Whitfield made calls today. Prepare." The number signed off with a single word: cross. She deleted the message. Powered down her phone. Finished her shift, changed out of her scrubs, and walked to the parking garage where her 2008 Honda Civic sat under fluorescent lights that made everything look like a crime scene. She sat in the driver's seat, keys in her ignition, and didn't turn it over. Her hands rested on the steering wheel. Outside, Savannah's humidity pressed against the windows like something alive, something waiting. The combat boots were still in her locker at the hospital. Everything she'd kept from before, the only thing she'd kept from before, was still there. Laced boots worn in sand on the other side of the world, sitting in a locker that security could access with a master key, visible as evidence of exactly what Whitfield needed to know to destroy her completely. The fire alarm shattered the night shift at 0230 with a sound that belonged in a war zone, not a hospital. A shriek that didn't stop, that wouldn't stop, that pulled every protocol from the darkness and snapped them into place like weapons loading. Evacuation routes activated. Wheelchairs mobilized. Night shift nurses moved through corridors they'd walked 1,000 times, suddenly transformed into unfamiliar terrain by smoke and chaos and the mechanical wail that kept screaming overhead. Patients stirred. Call buttons lit up. The ER filled with the hiss of oxygen masks and the squeak of stretcher wheels against tile as staff moved toward exits, toward safety, toward the parking lot where the fire trucks were already converging with their lights painting the darkness red and orange and urgent. Hannah Clarke didn't move toward the exits. She stood in the break room for 1 second, 2 seconds, listening to the alarm like she was translating its frequency into something meaningful. Her hands were steady. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling was restraint, the body remembering what happened when you hesitated, when you froze, when you let someone else make the decisions. Footsteps pounded past her down the corridor. Someone shouted about evacuation procedures. The alarm screamed its mechanical demand for movement. Hannah walked the opposite direction, toward the staff lockers, her steps precise and quiet against the chaos. She opened hers at 0231. The boots were still there. They shouldn't have been. 6 months she'd told herself she'd gotten rid of them, burned them, buried them in some box in some storage unit where they couldn't betray her. But no. They were here. Worn tan leather creased with memories, laces frayed from sand in Helmand province, the right heel scuffed where shrapnel had kissed the leather during the extraction from Marja. The only thing she kept. The only thing she couldn't throw away because throwing it away meant erasing the person who had worn them, the Master Chief who had carried 17 people out of mortar fire and hadn't stopped moving until the last one was safe. Hannah laced them tight. 1 pull, 2 pulls, the muscle memory so automatic her hands didn't need instructions from her brain. The smoke thickened in the corridor. The ventilator on the floor above wheezed its mechanical rhythm through the vents, a sound like something drowning. She could hear it because she was listening for it, because staying alive meant listening for everything, the direction of wind, the distance of footsteps, the seconds ticking before the next round came in. Her jaw tightened for half a second as she tied the final knot. Then she moved. Room for 12 was 3 corridors east. Room for 08 was already empty, evacuation complete. Room for 10 held Mrs. Valdez, 73, post-op from hip replacement, moving in slow confused motions toward the window thinking that was the exit. Hannah was there in 8 seconds. With me. Not a request. Mrs. Valdez looked at her face and didn't argue. Room for 12. Major Vincent Cross was already awake, already reaching for his full line, already knowing without being told that something was different about the way this nurse moved toward him. The chest tube still draining. The surgical site reopened half an inch from the fire evacuation stress. But his eyes were clear. Military eyes. They recognized what they were seeing. "We're going down," Hannah said. 8 words. All he needed. 3 more rooms down the corridor. Room for 14 held Mr. Chen, gasping for breath, oxygen saturation dropping as smoke filtered through the ventilation system. Hannah moved him into the hallway, her hand supporting his weight with the kind of efficiency that belonged in a combat medevac, not a civilian hospital. Her voice stayed level. "Breathe shallow. Don't fight it. We're moving." The stairs were to the left. The fire roared somewhere above them, a sound like distant artillery, like something angry and hungry and taking its time. Hannah counted heads as she moved. Cross, Mrs. Valdez, Mr. Chen. 3 down. 3 more. The evacuation had missed them, the ones too weak to move on their own, the ones the first sweep had deemed mobile enough and had been wrong. The ones the night shift had forgotten in the chaos of protocols and procedures and the screaming alarm that didn't stop. Room for 16. Pediatric case. 8-year-old girl named Sophia with her mother still at bedside, already moving. Thank God. Hannah nodded and kept walking. Room for 18. Mr. Park, diabetic, post-amputation, couldn't walk. She had him in her arms in one motion, not carrying him like something fragile, but moving him like cargo that mattered, like the weight was familiar and her shoulders could bear it and it didn't matter how many pounds he was because he was moving and that was the only variable that existed. 4. 5. Her breathing stayed controlled. Her hands didn't shake. Marja had taught her that adrenaline was a tool, not an enemy. Use it. Channel it. Let your hands do the work your brain had already planned. The smoke got thicker on the stairs. The stairwell was sealed from the main corridor, which meant it was momentarily clear, but the fire was below them on the 2nd floor, the electrical room, someone would later determine, and the smoke rose like a living thing, like something pursuing. Hannah could taste copper and burning insulation and something chemical that didn't have a name yet. Her lungs registered it as dangerous. Her feet kept moving. 2 flights down. Major Cross was breathing hard, his chest wound pulling with every step, but he moved like a soldier, no complaints, no hesitation. Mrs. Valdez wheezed. Mr. Chen's hand gripped Hannah's shoulder like her anchor. She was solid. She didn't break stride. The landing between the 1st and ground floors. For steps from safety. That's where Major Cross's heart stopped. 1 second he was breathing. The next second his face went grey and he collapsed against the metal railing with a sound like a body hitting concrete. His eyes rolled back. His breath stopped. Hannah caught him before he fell, one hand supporting his weight, and in the same motion she was laying him flat on the concrete landing and her hands were already moving. The chest incision from surgery was reopened, the sutures torn by the exertion and the smoke and the pure biological fact that his body had decided it couldn't do this anymore. She could see the edges of the surgical site bleeding. "Keep moving," she said to the others. Not across. To the people still standing. Ground floor. Exit through the north door. Go. Her voice had changed. It wasn't the deferential tone of the night shift nurse anymore. It was a command. It was authority. It was the sound of someone who had trained for exactly this moment and didn't need to explain herself. Hannah's hands moved on their own, driven by a decade of combat medicine and nerve blocks and the pure simple fact that she had done this before in conditions worse than this. She opened his surgical site with her fingers, careful and brutal and necessary. The chest cavity was still open, still healing. She found the heart with the precision of someone who had done cardiac massage in a firefight and a supply shortage and the kind of darkness that came from thinking you were about to die. Her fingers compressed against the myocardium. 30 compressions. Clean. Measured. Brutal. The heartbeat came back at compression 34. 1 beat. 2 beats. Sinus rhythm establishing. His oxygen saturation climbing on the monitor she didn't have but could read in the color of his lips returning from gray to something approaching normal. His eyes fluttered. "I need you awake," she said. 7 words. His eyes focused on her face and something shifted behind them. Recognition. Understanding. The realization that the quiet nurse adjusting his for every night wasn't just a nurse at all. Hannah helped him sit up and kept one hand on his chest. "We're walking. 2 flights. You can bleed later." She wasn't being cruel. She was being accurate. The chest wound would leak. The scar would tear further. The sutures would fail. But he would walk. He would move. He would get to the ground floor where the paramedics were already entering with their oxygen kits and their protocols and their certainty that they understood what had just happened here. He would survive because stopping meant dying, and dying wasn't on either of their schedules. They reached the ground floor at 0239. She had the remaining patients down in under 9 minutes. Cross beside her, bleeding slowly, breathing hard, his eyes never leaving her face like she might vanish if he stopped looking. Mrs. Valdez leaning on her right side. Mr. Chen supported by her left. 2 others behind them, mobile now that they understood moving was the variable that mattered. The doors burst open to the sound of sirens and running footsteps and the smell of diesel exhaust mixing with burned insulation. Paramedics flooded the space. Protocols. Questions. Emergency procedures. Hannah released them into those hands and stepped back into the shadows of the lobby, her boots still laced tight, her chest heaving not from exertion but from the adrenaline crash that came when the body realized it could finally stop being precise. She could taste blood. Her own or someone else's, didn't matter. She could hear the rotor wash in the distance, the helicopter coming in for the critical case, the machinery of emergency response that would take over now, that would handle it, that would make the decisions. She looked up and through the window she could see Dr. Whitfield standing on the concrete of the parking lot, arms crossed, watching as the fire department contained the blaze at the electrical room. His expression was calculating. His eyes were tracking her as she moved past the paramedics, as she disappeared back into the building, as she registered that she had just violated every protocol the hospital had written. She had performed an unauthorized procedure in an unsecured location. She had moved patients without physician supervision. She had taken action that belonged in the military, not in civilian medicine, and she had done it where someone was watching. Someone was always watching. That was the problem with a hospital full of witnesses. That was the problem with being noticed. But that wasn't the worst part. The operating room doors sealed at 0340, and Hannah Clarke ceased to exist the moment Major Cross's chest opened again. Dr. Patel worked with controlled fury, his fingers moving through blood and tissue, following the trajectory of damage that Hannah's direct cardiac massage had caused: fractured ribs, lacerated pericardium, a sternum that had been compressed with the force of someone who understood exactly how much pressure a human body could withstand and survive. The monitors beeped their mechanical rhythm. O2 sat climbing. Pressure stabilizing. 1 hour and 43 minutes of surgical precision, and Major Vincent Cross was sutured back together, his heart still beating because a nurse in combat boots had known the difference between saving a life and letting one slip away on a stairwell landing. Hannah didn't watch from the observation gallery. She was already packing her locker by the time Patel closed the final suture. The suspension papers arrived at noon, and delivered by a security guard who wouldn't meet her eyes. 2 pages. Single-spaced. Language like illegal guillotine, reckless endangerment, unauthorized medical intervention, failure to follow established protocol during emergency evacuation, gross deviation from hospital standard of care. The document trembled slightly as he handed it to her. Dr. Whitfield asked me to escort you to your vehicle, he said quietly. There was apology in his voice. There was also the weight of a paycheck that didn't permit defiance. She took the papers without reading them. She already knew what they said. She already knew who had written them. The walk through St. Michael's to the parking garage felt like moving through water. Faces turned. Conversation stopped. The whisper preceded her like a shock wave, suspended, fired, gone. The security guard maintained position 3 steps behind her, professional distance, just close enough to ensure compliance. They descended the concrete stairs to level 3. Her Camry sat in space 47, paint faded to the color of old bone, windshield sticky with salt spray from the Savannah River. She unlocked it. Saturday. Turned the key. The engine cranked once, twice, and died, the battery finally giving up its ghost after 2 months of her avoiding the repair it desperately needed. I'll call a cab, she said. Her voice sounded like it was coming from someone else's throat. The security guard nodded and retreated back up the stairs, his obligation fulfilled. Hannah rested her forehead against the steering wheel and felt something inside her chest crack open like old concrete. Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke officially didn't exist anymore. The Pentagon had buried her at Marja with the same precision they'd buried the operation itself. She was ordered to disappear, given a new social security number, told never to surface, never to contact her unit, never to acknowledge the 12 years she'd spent wearing a uniform and carrying a rifle and teaching herself to move through the world like a ghost. The paperwork had been constructed by professionals, the kind of professionals who made people vanish without leaving bodies. New identity. New employment history. New life constructed from fabrication and necessary lies. Except lies left holes. Holes that Dr. Whitfield, brilliant, vicious Dr. Whitfield, had already begun to excavate. Her phone buzzed at 12:45. Text from an unknown number, he's asking for you. Security tried to stop him from calling out. He made them anyway. It was from a hospital phone, from someone inside, from someone with access. Hannah didn't know who. She didn't ask. At 13:02, Dr. Whitfield made his first call from his office on the 6th floor. The hospital board chairman, a man named Sterling who owed Whitfield access to a referral pipeline worth 6 figures annually. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. A situation. Clarke. The fire. Unauthorized procedure. Liability nightmare. Recommend immediate termination. Yes, I'll handle documentation. Click. Done. The second call came at 13:18 to the State Licensing Board in Atlanta. 20 minutes on hold, then a woman with the voice of an insurance adjuster. Whitfield's tone shifted to concerned physician reporting a safety violation. I'm filing a formal report. Reckless endangerment. Emergency services personnel. Patient complications following unauthorized intervention. No, I have no documentation yet. The investigation is preliminary. But yes, given the severity, I believe you should open an inquiry. The woman on the other end was typing. Whitfield had calculated correctly. The state board moves slowly, but once a formal complaint exists, it becomes a thing that must be investigated. Truth is secondary. The complaint itself is the weapon. The third call came at 13:42 to a private investigator named Marcus Webb, someone Whitfield had used twice before for employment verification on nursing candidates. I need a background investigation. Hannah Clarke. Nurse. Hired 6 months ago. I'm concerned about discrepancies in her employment history. Yes, I have the resume. No, I don't have contact information for her references yet. That's what I need you to find. Whitfield paused, letting the implication settle. I suspect falsified credentials. Contact everything, everyone. Financial records if possible. I need this expedited. He hung up, and somewhere in Savannah, a man in a strip mall office began typing names that didn't exist into a database that would return nothing. The fourth call came at 14:01. Dr. Whitfield stood at his office window, watching the parking garage entrance below, watching Hannah's form disappear into the concrete darkness. He dialed a number he'd written down from Hannah's employment application, a nursing reference who had supposedly supervised her at a hospital in Portland that she'd supposedly worked at for 3 years. The number was disconnected. Whitfield hadn't expected it to connect. That was the point. These were holes. These were discrepancies. These were the kind of things that accumulate like infection in a wound, spreading through institutional tissue until the body's immune system activates and destroys the foreign organism. Hannah sat in her car at 14:30 with the door locked and her forehead against the steering wheel. The engine was dead. The battery was dead. The carefully rebuilt life that she'd spent 3 years constructing, going to nursing school at night, passing her boards, working through the hiring process at St. Michael's, learning to be invisible, learning to be small, learning to be nothing, was now actively disintegrating. The Pentagon couldn't acknowledge her. The moment they did, Marja would surface. The moment Marja surfaced, investigations would begin. Not into her, but into the operation itself. Into what happened to those 4 teammates. Into why 17 lives had mattered more than telling the truth about how they'd been saved. Into classified operations and covert insertions and rules of engagement that existed in the legal space between policy and denial. The Pentagon protected itself by protecting her anonymity. Whitfield had understood that instinctively. He'd understood that Hannah Clarke had no institutional support, no chain of command to defend her, no agency that could validate her service without destroying itself in the process. She was alone. That was the architecture of her erasure. Her phone buzzed again at 14:45. Different number. A voice she recognized from 2 years ago, Clarke. It's Major Cross. I'm calling some people. Don't do anything stupid until I get back to you. The line went dead before she could respond. She stared at her phone screen. Cross was post-surgical. Cross should be sedated. Cross was making calls that would activate networks and pull strings and reach up into the kind of institutional authority that had the power to override hospital administrators and state boards and private investigators. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she couldn't let him. The worst part was that the moment he made that call, the moment any official military presence acknowledged her, the classified operation began to unravel. She turned the key again. The engine didn't even crank. The battery was completely dead, same as everything else. Hannah closed her eyes and waited. The local news broke the story at 1700 with a headline that would follow Dr. Whitfield for the rest of his life: decorated war hero fired from hospital job, military intervenes. The footage showed the Special Forces colonel walking him out of the administrative wing, Whitfield's face the color of a tomato, his voice rising to a pitch that made the cameraman flinch. This is illegal. I have contracts, I have rights here, but the board chairman was already on the phone with the hospital's attorneys in the background, and the phrase liability exposure came up 14 times in the first conversation alone. By 1900, Whitfield's carefully constructed network had evaporated like morning fog over the Savannah River. The chief of surgery sent him to voicemail. The cardiology director's assistant informed him that her boss was unavailable indefinitely. Board Chairman Hastings blocked his number entirely and instructed security not to admit him to the building. The isolation was absolute. He tried calling colleagues he'd mentored, residents he'd trained, administrators he'd worked with for 15 years. Every single one of them had suddenly become unreachable, and in the silence of unanswered phones, Whitfield finally understood what it meant to be expendable. The state nursing board withdrew their complaint against Hannah within 48 hours. A single phone call from a Pentagon liaison was apparently sufficient to dissolve 17 years of bureaucratic process. The private investigator refunded Whitfield's retainer with an email so terse it barely qualified as communication: cannot continue this investigation. Recommend you retain counsel immediately. There was no explanation, no elaboration, just the cold precision of someone who had been told to stop asking questions and recognized the weight of that order. Hannah's employment record was simultaneously reclassified and restored. The holes in her paperwork that had seemed so damning 24 hours earlier suddenly filled themselves with documents that had existed all along but required presidential authority to access. She wasn't reinstated, that would have been too simple. Instead, she was offered a new contract with terms that made the hospital's liability team weep with relief, a position as senior night shift supervisor with a 40% salary increase, hazard pay that predated her suspension, a formal written apology from the board, and a clause that made termination without cause functionally impossible. The hospital's attorney had recommended it personally. The decision was not negotiable. Whitfield's medical license entered review status within 72 hours, but not because of the fire incident. The state medical board's investigation focused instead on a pattern of behavior that 16 nurses had suddenly documented in writing now that Dr. Whitfield held no institutional power over their careers. Complaints that had been filed quietly over 3 years were now cross-referenced, analyzed, and treated with a kind of systematic attention that suggested someone official had taken a personal interest. Conduct unbecoming a physician. Verbal abuse of subordinate staff. Creating a hostile work environment. Deliberate endangerment of patient care protocols. Each complaint was meticulously documented, each one supported by witness statements that materialized from nurses who had previously been too afraid to speak. The hospital offered him a quiet resignation to avoid public proceedings. He refused. He threatened litigation. He hired an attorney who took one meeting, listened to the scope of the evidence, and told him with the kind of gentle finality that Whitfield had never heard before, "The case is unwinnable. I recommend you accept the separation package and consider relocating." Whitfield rejected that advice too. 3 weeks later, facing suspension and potential loss of licensure, he finally understood he had no choice. The interview at Savannah Community College took place on a Wednesday afternoon in an office that smelled like old coffee and laminated textbooks. The hiring manager was a former EMT named Patricia Gomez who had watched the news coverage with her family and recognized Whitfield's name the moment he walked through the door. She asked thoughtful questions about his teaching philosophy, his experience with diverse student populations, his ability to create an inclusive learning environment. Every question was technically appropriate, but the subtext was visible. This woman knew exactly who he was and what he'd done, and she was evaluating not his qualifications but his capacity for humility. The position was CPR Fundamentals Instructor for the community college's Emergency Response Certification Program. The pay was $18 an hour. No benefits. No tenure track. No research opportunities or departmental prestige. The hiring manager explained that the previous instructor had left to pursue other opportunities, and the college was committed to finding someone who genuinely cared about student development rather than credential collection. Whitfield got the job because no one else had applied. He started 3 weeks later. His first class met in a windowless basement room that smelled like old gym mats and industrial bleach, fluorescent lights humming above a row of plastic mannequins with their chests open and their mechanical hearts exposed. 30 teenagers sat in folding chairs, most of them satisfying a graduation requirement, none of them paying particular attention until one student, a girl in the third row with her phone already out, raised her hand and asked, "Weren't you on TV?" The silence that followed was the sound of institutional collapse. Whitfield felt it settle over the room like anesthesia, heavy and inescapable. He cleared his throat and said, "Yes. That's correct." One student nodded slowly. Another one whispered something to her neighbor. And Whitfield spent the next 2 hours teaching chest compressions to teenagers who would spend the next 2 hours wondering if they were learning CPR from someone who had actually deserved what the news said he deserved. He could see it in their eyes, the calculation, the judgment, the decision being made in real time about whether to trust this man with information that could someday save a life. The weight of being seen without power was suffocating. At night, Whitfield sat in his car in his driveway, the one he still owned, the one his wife had left through an hour before his first class, and stared at the house that no longer felt like his. Divorce papers lay on the passenger seat, signed by her attorney, waiting only for his signature. The house was dark because his wife had taken the children to her mother's place in Atlanta. She'd left a note on the kitchen counter, "I can't be married to a man the entire world is ashamed of. I can't explain you to my friends. I can't explain you to our children. I'm done trying. The words were efficient, like everything she'd ever said, but they carried the kind of finality that made Whitfield understand for the first time that some bridges don't just burn, they vanish completely. He'd spent 23 years building a reputation as a surgeon, as a leader, as someone important. He'd dismantled it all in approximately 72 hours by underestimating a nurse. The mathematics of it seemed almost poetic in its precision. Meanwhile, Hannah sat in her apartment and read the news coverage on her laptop, the screen casting shadows across her face at 0300 in the morning. The veteran security guard, Roy Mackey, 30 years in the Navy, petty officer 2nd class, had served in the same region during the same operational window, had given an interview to the local news affiliate. He'd told them what he'd heard when the colonel spoke her name. He'd explained rank structure to the civilian reporter, who'd had to do research to understand what a Master Chief Petty Officer actually was, who'd learned that the rank sat below only officers and represented 20-plus years of military service and institutional knowledge. Roy had looked directly at the camera and said, "I knew what I was hearing. I've heard that voice my whole career. It's the voice of someone telling you to stand down, and you stand down because the alternative is being wrong in front of God and everyone." That nurse saved lives. That hospital had no idea what she was. The news report had footage of Roy walking out of the hospital after giving his statement, his uniform in his truck at home, his bearing unmistakable even in civilian clothes. Hannah understood in that moment that her carefully constructed anonymity had exploded like an IED, leaving fragments of her past scattered across 1,000 screens throughout Savannah. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was legend. And there was no such thing as a quiet legend. Her phone had been ringing all day, news organizations, interview requests, a literary agent asking if she'd considered writing a memoir, 3 different military charities wanting her to speak at fundraisers. She'd declined every one of them. She'd sat in her apartment with the television playing and the sound off, reading the closed captions as news anchors discussed the nurse who brought them back from the brink, showing footage of the hospital, showing photographs of Major Cross in his uniform before his injury, showing the combat boots that someone had apparently photographed being carried into the hospital during the fire evacuation. The boots were everywhere. Her combat boots, the only thing she'd kept from before, suddenly public property, suddenly a symbol, suddenly evidence that the quiet nurse in the hospital corridors had been something else entirely. But that wasn't the part that made her understand she had to make a choice. The part that mattered was the photograph of Dr. Whitfield being escorted out of the administrative building, his face the color of rage, his authority dissolving in real time as he walked past a line of nurses who watched him leave with the kind of empty expressions they'd learned to perfect under his administration. He was being carried out, not physically, but professionally, institutionally, completely. The hospital had already hired his replacement, a woman with 30 years of surgical experience and a reputation for excellence that had nothing to do with humiliation or control. By the time Hannah finished reading about Whitfield's new position at the community college, she understood that the machinery of consequence had already been set in motion, and she was now responsible for deciding whether she belonged in it. At 1500 the next afternoon, the Blackhawk touched down in the hospital courtyard like a statement of fact, its rotor wash rattling the windows and clearing the parking lot of every person not absolutely essential to hospital operations. Hannah stood watching from the 3rd-floor window, her badge around her neck, her name finally printed correctly on the ID card. The Special Forces colonel descended first, followed by 2 soldiers in dress uniform and a medical officer carrying a sealed folder. Behind them came Major Vincent Cross, no longer in the wheelchair, still favoring his left side where the direct cardiac massage had broken 2 ribs, but standing with the kind of bearing that came from knowing he was alive because someone had chosen to save him. The colonel entered the administrative wing, and Hannah watched from above as he walked through the hospital corridors like someone who owned them, like someone searching for something specific. When he emerged from the elevator on the 3rd floor, Hannah was already waiting in the hallway, boots laced tight, the same ones she'd carried through the fire, cleaned and oiled now, regulation perfect. The colonel extended the folder without preamble. "Your record's been partially declassified. You can exist again. We'd like you back, training command, mentorship role, full benefits and rank restoration." His voice was exactly as Major Cross had described it, like a tank idling in a garage, impossible to ignore, difficult to refuse. Hannah took the folder and didn't open it. She looked instead at the patients watching from their rooms down the corridor, Mrs. Chen in 408 waving with both hands, Mr. Patel standing in his doorway with his four-pole, 3 others she'd carried down the stairs during the fire. Cross followed her gaze and understood before she said anything. "I didn't recognize you that night. I'm sorry." Hannah shook her head once, precise as a knife stroke. "You weren't supposed to." She handed the folder back to the colonel. "I'm honored. But I need to stay." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds, the kind of silence that made the fluorescent lights above seem impossibly loud. The colonel nodded slowly. He'd expected this, or something like it. "You sure?" Hannah smiled, barely, the first genuine expression anyone at St. Michael's had seen from her, and it was enough to make the colonel understand what Major Cross had been trying to tell him since he woke up from surgery. "I'm sure." The Blackhawk lifted off at 15:30, and Hannah walked back into the hospital where the chief of surgery waited with her badge and a new contract. She returned to the night shift because that's where she was needed, took report at 1900, and moved through the corridors with the same quiet precision that had become her signature, except now when she entered a room, people recognized what they were looking at. They didn't call her by her call sign. They didn't treat her differently. But they understood that the nurse adjusting their four was the same person who had carried them down a burning staircase, the same person who had performed direct cardiac massage through an open chest wound on the landing between floors, the same person who had chosen their lives over her own carefully constructed anonymity. In the break room at 0200, a young nurse asked her, "Is it true? All of it?" Hannah poured coffee into a cup that said St. Michael's night shift in faded lettering, considered the question for exactly 2 seconds, and said the only thing that actually mattered, the ones who have seen the worst often give the most. She took her cup and returned to her rounds, and the hospital learned to see her not as a ghost, but as exactly who she'd always been. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated or judged by someone who didn't know your value, please like and subscribe. Share Hannah's story with someone who needs to know that quiet strength is the deadliest kind. And comment below, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Let's talk about it.